Irony. You probably know it as the theme song to Orimo, or as an excuse people give for watching Orimo. But did you know that it's also a literary and rhetorical technique that uses intentional incongruities between text and subtext to create meaning? For example, one could present a joke definition of a word as though it represented standard usage, and then present the actual definition as though it was just a weird bit of trivia. Or, to give another example, one could describe something they literally just did as a wacky hypothetical. Alright, enough shtick. It's time to get sincere about irony. An irony is an irony. You can't say it's just a half. Irony is about contrast. And if you do things halfway, you just end up with a storytelling equivalent of gray words on a gray background. Despite what a bunch of trendy web developers seem to think, this is, in fact, a terrible idea. If one were to plot quality against irony levels, one would end up with something like a parabola, high at either end and low in the middle. This is something I like to refer to as the irony horseshoe. I realize horseshoes aren't actually parabolic, but they're close enough to work the visual metaphor. To demonstrate how the irony horseshoe works, we're going to look at 3 different shows from the much maligned Isekai subgenre. 2 that actually succeed by taking things to opposite extremes, and 1 that tries to split the difference and falls flat and is awful and I hate it. Let's start with Overlord, which occupies one of the extremes, that of complete sincerity. It responds to the question, isn't this all a bit silly, by looking the viewer right in the eye and proclaiming, so what? And like its skull-faced protagonist, Overlord never once blinks. It sets out its premise of an MMO player turned fantasy demigod, and doesn't try to pretend it's anything other than what it is. To demonstrate what I mean, let's look at the infamous buffing scene. Our protagonist, Momonga, is preparing to fight his DeviantArt OC turned enemy, Shaltir Bloodfallen. Yes, her name is Shaltir Bloodfallen. As with everything else in the show, they know how goofy it is, they know that you know how goofy it is, and they're fine with all that. After confirming that just casting a buff spell on himself won't provoke Shaltir, just like in the game, Momonga casts another one. Then he casts some more. And some more. All told, he casts 27 buffs, taking things far past the point where there can be any doubt as to whether the absurdity is intentional. However, the joke isn't signposted by the scene's direction in any way. The animation is quite subdued, and the whole scene is shot as a series of slow pans at rather conventional angles. The music is regular old fantasy music, the vocal delivery is similarly straightforward, and the buffs are represented visually and aurally with a series of effects that seem plucked from stock libraries. The show doesn't try to tell you how clever it thinks it's being, or how clever it thinks you are for getting it. It just does its thing, and trusts in the viewer to understand what they're looking at. KonoSuba, on the other hand, well, KonoSuba takes the piss like a stadium urinal. Absolutely everything in KonoSuba is a joke, and everything and everyone is in on it. Except for the characters themselves, that is. This is the other extreme, absolute irony. Answering the question, isn't this all a bit silly, by shouting back, no it isn't, it's a lot silly. If KonoSuba was a person, it would be the fun drunk who's an absolute nightmare to babysit once they sobered up. Which is why it's a very good thing the show never does. As a demonstration of how KonoSuba handles things, let's check out another extended spellcasting sequence. The first time Megumin busts out Megumin is every bit as dramatically extra as Momonga, but while Momonga is taken relatively seriously as a character, Megumin is portrayed as an absurd spectacle, starting from the very moment we're introduced to her. Megumin only casts the one spell, but the build-up to it is every bit as drawn out as Momonga's 27. They really put a lot of work into selling it. The visual flair, the ominous chanting, the portentous invocations. And then there's the one very large, very confused frog at the center of it to really highlight the absurdity. Everything goes to hell very shortly thereafter, but the show doesn't imply in the slightest you shouldn't laugh about it, because it's right there laughing with you. And then there's No Game, No Life. The stupid person's smart person's Sword Art Online. This will be the only mention of that show, I promise you. Someone please get that poor horse a dignified burial already. While the shows on both ends of the horseshoe engage with their silliness in good faith, either by embracing it or using it as a punchline, shows in the middle like No Game, No Life have the audacity to ask the viewer to indulge their nonsense, scoff at the notion that anyone would be so unsophisticated as to take them up on it, and then finally double back to chastise the viewer for not taking them seriously. As our demonstration of how No Game, No Life tries to have things both ways and succeeds at neither, we're going to look at the Materialization Shiritori game. It follows the rules of Shiritori, a simple Japanese word game for children, with one big twist. Every time someone names something, a magical crystal materializes it. They go through the rules, things start off with a bang, and then they settle into a holding pattern. So far, so good. This is one of the classic fight paradigms, where neither side is actually trying to win or even gain an immediate advantage, instead using the early stages of the battle to probe at their opponent's strategy, capabilities, and goals. And then this happens. Just like that, any notion of thoughtfulness is doused in gasoline by an unrepentantly trashy fanservice sequence complete with goofy sound effects, and then ignited by a jump forward showing that, after hours of play, the game has degenerated into a full-on farce. This, on its own, would be just fine, if not quite to my personal tastes. A serious setup followed by an irreverent punchline would have been a perfectly good arc had they followed through with it. But instead, things get serious again. A bunch of science stuff happens that doesn't really hold up under scrutiny, but is clearly supposed to sound clever. And the show all but lectures the audience about how turning off their brains after every single context clue instructed them that they should do so makes them not as smart as the writers. It's insincere, incoherent, and insulting. As the saying goes, fool me once, good for you. Fool me twice, go fuck yourself. So there you go, the irony horseshoe. It's a pretty broad concept, but the most important takeaway is this. If you're going to do something silly, sincerity and irony are both valid choices, as long as you don't jerk your audience around. What's important is that, as a storyteller, you commit to your choice. After all, why should I commit to your show if your show can't even commit to itself? As viewers, it's the least we deserve. Well, that's it for this one. If you enjoyed it, and I certainly hope you did, make sure to click all the usual buttons and share it to your various web zones and whatnot. You're smart internet people, you know how this works. I'll see you again when the next one's ready, so until then, keep the subculture safe, okay?